truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024, the 1189th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free a couple days later on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. So yesterday, we talked about how over the weekend, the Uniparty members of the illegitimate Congress gave their approval to Mike Johnson's package, officially known as the Unipartisan Compromise. And we discussed how the Uniparty decided to march forward with the Repo Act that would allow them to take $300 billion seized from Russian individuals and Russian organizations and then redistribute that money to Ukraine and various other regime partners and allies who need to be paid off if they're going to keep implementing this global regime plan once Trump is back in office and Trump cuts off the rest of their funding. They are willing to risk the so-called global economy and the dollar's status as the global reserve currency in order to do this. Crashing the currency was always part of the plan, and they have to be able to maintain control while knowing that they won't be receiving much help from the American Uniparty for what they hope to be the next 4 years, but will ultimately be forever. Now, I'm sure the stage show of it all was very effective, and it convinced people once again that their government really is corrupt, and now even Normie Con Inc. media figures on the Uniparty right are beginning to address the fact that we don't have two separate parties, we have a uniparty. Tucker Carlson put that out to the world on Joe Rogan's podcast that was released over the weekend. And as you might expect, the GOP establishment and elite, the Ron DeSantis supporters, Con Inc., they are very upset at Tucker Carlson. He is a conspiracy theorist now. We all know that we were told the truth about 9/11. There is no uniparty. Neocons are not globalists. They just really like bombing people on America's behalf. Tucker actually noted that he has quite a few friends who are still neocon warmongers. And you have to wonder why. But the cracks are beginning to show. People are beginning to understand there is this uniparty. They serve global interests, and they do not care at all about the will and the desires of the American people. And at some point in the next few weeks or the next few months, these standard issue villagers on the uniparty right might start to ask themselves, why don't any of these people care about what we want, what their own constituents want, the people who elect them? And they'll start asking again and again, and people will just tell them, well, they're in a good, safe red district, so they don't worry too much about re-election. And if instead of a red district, they're in a purple district, Well, then they went along with what their constituents want, because the district being purple means there are more Democrats there. And that means that the conservatives have more Democrat beliefs. Now, that doesn't make sense, but what legacy political analysis does make sense anymore? After they receive these unsatisfying answers for a few more weeks or a few more months, as their confusion and frustration grows, they might begin to consider that maybe the reason these members of Congress, these uniparty members, aren't concerned about being reelected is because the elections aren't real. And they'll have that realization. At the same time, more evidence comes out proving that the elections aren't real. All of these narrative storylines will be converging and completing at the very same point on a timeline, creating maximum impact. But don't call it a plan. That would be a conspiracy theory. Let's go back to the Repo Act and the fact that our illegitimate Congress just approved of a violation of international law. They are going to steal something from another country and give it to a third country. A few hundred unelected representatives of an illegitimate American government just decided to crash the world economy and publicly rob a country that has been dominating them in one of their key proxy state strongholds. These people are supposedly the serious ones. They are supposedly the adults in the room. They are so smart and so capable and so committed that they had to steal our election. It was the only responsible thing to do. If we didn't put them back in power, something bad was going to happen. Therefore, stolen elections. Now, Sputnik Africa did an interview with the chairwoman of the upper house of the Russian government. Her name is Valentina Matvienko. She told Sputnik that using frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine will just destroy the world economy. Such a move, she said, will destroy confidence in the world economy. Sputnik, of course, is referred to by the regime's propaganda media as state media in Russia, and we don't even need to deny that to point out the irony of a global regime state media. That media does not exist to serve the interests of the American people. But that media telling us that other media is propaganda and state media. As we watch them pretend that Joe Biden not only received 81 million real lawful American votes and is a legitimate president, he's one of the best presidents America has ever had. Sputnik also published some comments from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov and the Minister of Foreign Affairs Maria Zakharova. The headline from Sunday: if U.S. goes ahead with seizure of Russian assets, its fiscal reputation will suffer, Kremlin says. As for Peskov, he said in response to the approval of Mike Johnson's package, as for the legislation on the confiscation of Russian assets, we still need to sort out the details. If this is really the case, America will have to answer for it. And here there are unlikely to be any time limits, and we will do it in a way that best suits our interests. Peskov warned that the confiscation of Russian assets by Washington would cause, quote unquote, irreparable harm to America's image in financial circles, forcing investors to, quote, save their funds because the principle of the inviolability of private property will be violated, especially state property. Roughly $300 billion in Russian assets were trapped abroad and frozen in the U.S. and European countries in February 2022 after the escalation of the Ukrainian crisis into a full-blown Russia-NATO proxy war. An estimated $6 billion plus of these funds are sitting in U.S. banks, with the majority of the money stuck in German, French, and Belgian institutions. Regarding the $61 billion for Ukraine, Peskov said, the decision to provide assistance to Ukraine was expected and predictable. This will further enrich the United States of America and further ruin Ukraine, resulting in more dead Ukrainians through the fault of the Kyiv regime. Zakharova said the allocation of military assistance by the United States to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan will aggravate global crises. Assistance to the Kyiv regime constitutes direct sponsorship of terrorist activities. Assistance to Taiwan constitutes interference in China's internal affairs. Assistance to Israel is a direct path to escalating what is already an unprecedented escalation in the region. And it would be difficult to make an argument that that is not how the rest of the world is seeing what is continually called, quote unquote, the West, which is just the global regime. At some point, we might actually have to deal with the pretense of these high-level global regime actors who claim that somehow we wouldn't have high culture if it weren't for them. Now, I suppose at some point in history that may well have been true, but the people who make up this global regime are generations down from when the whole thing started. These are the incompetent descendants of the people who thought all this up, and their aesthetic tastes do not represent high culture. Most of the culture they create is an absolute abomination and of very poor artistic quality. Their creative minds have been debased in the same way that their moral minds and their political minds have been debased. What else could we possibly expect? But Zakharova is pinning all of this on the United States. And of course, the United States is, to some extent appropriately, the avatar of this evil global regime. She says assistance to Kyiv constitutes direct sponsorship of terrorism. Assistance to Taiwan is meddling in Chinese affairs, and assistance to Israel is intentionally escalating an already escalated situation. Now, American media and standard issue villagers who support the Uniparty would not agree with any of that. And it's possible that you might not either. But it doesn't make any difference whatsoever, because all of this is already baked into the cake, and Russia's point of view is shared by their allies and coalition partners within BRICS, representing more than half the world's population and more than half the world's economy. As we discussed last week, all of what we're seeing is a refutation of the global regime, the power of the quote-unquote West. All of that power is derived from the United States military's use of force in controlling nations and resources around the world. That is one of the options, with the global regime's use of the fiat currency, currently branded as the American dollar, to wage economic warfare on other countries. And I suppose you could talk about the entertainment propaganda that we export and the censorship and technology we export as lower level means of influence. But traditionally, it is the power of the American military as the world's police and the power of the dollar as the global reserve currency that the central bankers can manipulate. Sanctions can be applied, or investments can be made and bribes paid for good behavior and compliance. These are the two primary tools they have used to build this global regime, and we can see quite clearly, we are being shown quite clearly, that they are no longer able to wield either of these weapons with virtually any efficacy whatsoever. Far from making the world a safer place and the United States safer, because all of this is supposed to be about national security. It's supposed to be about maintaining peace across the world. I mean, these are the justifications they give to the American people when they tell them, sorry, we don't care what you want. This is going to happen, and it's going to be done in your name because you elected us. So far from any of that, this is actually making the world a more dangerous place, and it will be laid at the feet of the American Uniparty and its allies in Europe. And of course, that's where the responsibility rightfully belongs. Let's get back to the chairwoman of the Russian upper house. In her interview with Sputnik, she reinforced that regardless of any of this spending, the United States is not going to be able to accomplish anything militarily, anything, they're not going to do anything. She said these missiles will go astray just like all other missiles, and this will not fundamentally affect the course of the special military operation. There is nothing unexpected about the fact that they allocated money. She said the West, quote, is not able to do anything militarily. And then there is this interesting part. Matvienko stated that the supplies are aimed at serving American interests, particularly to support their military industry. Is the illegitimate regime trying to create a massive financial windfall for the military-industrial complex and military contractors? Do they think this is going to somehow help them stay in power? Or is all of this being done without any input whatsoever from Joe Biden or this illegitimate Congress? Is this all just military spending meant to build up the U.S. military according to the wishes of the duly elected president, which is Donald J. Trump? The question must be asked. So that was Sputnik Africa reporting on the Russian reaction to Mike Johnson's package. The global regime's propaganda media says Mike Johnson's package is very big and very powerful, and Russia basically saw it and laughed. But Russia isn't the only country laughing at the bygone power of the global regime, and we can stick with Africa. This is the Associated Press over the weekend. This is from Saturday. The U.S. military will begin plans to withdraw troops from Niger. Well, how about that? But before we get into that, let's flash back to 6 weeks ago, March 18th, 2024. This is also the Associated Press, just to get a little context on how this story is being reframed and retold as the underlying reality that's emerging begins to make the global regime look more and more feckless. So this is the AP from March 18th. U.S. weighing options in Africa after Niger junta orders departure from key counterterrorism base. Now, you might remember at the end of last summer, beginning of last fall, we were talking a lot about these African nations who were throwing the elements of the global regime out. These are former colonies of European countries, and those countries are being forced to leave. We talked last summer about the countries who had been able to accomplish this actually formed a connected land bridge across Central Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. But let's get into this article from March in the Associated Press. The Pentagon is working with Niger officials seeking a way for U.S. troops to stay in the country, a key base for counterterrorism operations in sub-Saharan Africa, following a weekend directive that they leave. Last week, a high-level delegation of U.S. officials, including Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Molly Fee, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs Celeste Wallander, and the head of U.S. Africa Command General Michael Langley, traveled to Niger to meet with members of the military junta. Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh said Monday the U.S. officials had lengthy and direct discussions with the junta officials that were also in part spurred by concerns over Niger's potential relationships with Russia and Iran. We were troubled on the path that Niger is on, Singh said. Very, very sad. Very sad. I feel bad for the illegitimate Biden administration. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said the U.S. was, quote, closely monitoring the Russian defense activities in order to, quote, assess and mitigate potential risk to U.S. personnel, interests, and assets, end quote. On Saturday, following the meeting, the junta's spokesperson, Colonel Major Amadou Abdrahmane, said U.S. flights over Niger's territory in recent weeks were illegal. Meanwhile, Insa Garba Saidu, a local activist who assists Niger's military rulers with their communications, criticized U.S. efforts to force the junta to pick between strategic partners. The American bases and civilian personnel cannot stay on Nigerian soil any longer, he told the Associated Press. And with the country Niger, it's IEN at the end. When it's Nigeria, they just add the N. Singh said the U.S. was aware of the March 16th statement, quote, announcing the end of the status of forces agreement between Niger and the United States. We are working through diplomatic channels to seek clarification, she said. These are ongoing discussions, and we don't have more to share at this time. State Department spokesman Vedant Patel said the discussions were prompted by Niger's quote-unquote trajectory. We are in touch with transition authorities to seek clarification of their comments and discuss additional steps, Patel said. So they thought they had options here. They were still going to push it. They didn't have any options. The option was, no, we said get out. The junta has largely been in control in Niger since July, when mutinous soldiers ousted the country's democratically elected president and months later asked French forces to leave. So you see, the president was elected totally democratically, but also they were still a French colony. It's kind of like us with the British or us with Israel. We are told by both that we have democratic elections. And we're told by media controlled by the UK and Israel and American intelligence agencies that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes, which means he is our democratically elected president, and we're not allowed to dispute that. If we do, elements of that global regime will come to our country and make sure that the democratically elected president remains in place. The story here is essentially what I was talking about last week and then over the weekend at GART regarding Alex Garland's movie Civil War. The global regime wants to remain in the country and in power to make sure that a global regime allied government remains in place regardless of the will of the people of Niger. How many times do we need to see this happen around the world before we understand that the global regime is not in these countries to protect their democratically elected leader? And when the regime assets and allies are removed and imprisoned, those aren't military juntas. That's what the people of the country want. This is how they will display what's happening here to the rest of the world when it begins to happen, when Trump is back in power and people need to start being arrested and detained and prosecuted and who knows what else, the global regime's media outlets will attempt to convince the rest of the world that there has been a military takeover of the United States and there is this crazed fascist regime hunting its political opponents in order to remain in power forever. And the thing they will be describing is the duly elected leader enforcing the law in response to rampant violations of human rights, crimes against the country, and crimes against humanity. But back to the article. The U.S. military still had some 650 troops working in Niger in December, largely consolidated at a base farther away from Niamey, Niger's capital. Singh said the total number of personnel still in country, including civilians and contractors, is roughly 1,000. The Niger base is critical for U.S. counterterrorism operations in the Sahel and has been used for both manned and unmanned surveillance options, although Singh said the only drone flights being currently conducted are for force protection. In the Sahel, the U.S. has also supported local ground troops, including accompanying them on missions. However, such accompanied missions have been scaled back since U.S. troops were killed in a joint operation in Niger in 2017. And we have discussed the Sahel before. It is an area from west to east across Africa. It looks like just a stripe, a belt around Africa. And it overlaps almost exactly with that land bridge I was discussing earlier. The global regime, the World Economic Forum, they had great plans for this region. And you can go to the World Economic Forum's website, weforum.org, and read about their plans for the Sahel. They have numerous articles of all these wonderful entrepreneurs and startups who have begun doing business there. This is very similar in concept to what I was discussing yesterday with the planned reconstruction of Ukraine. They take aligned corporate partners, entities, entrepreneurs, whatever, put a bunch of money behind them and base them in this country that they're attempting to infiltrate and take over. The amount of investment begins to enrich the community that builds up around this new business, and everyone thinks they are at the dawn of a great new age. If you are well behaved and you comply with the agenda, then money will flow. If you don't go along with the plan, you will get no money and it will be ever harder to compete. Of course, all of this requires political support, so they're happy to pay for that as well. And within a decade or a couple decades, you have a completely different country. They do this in America too, and they tell you where they're doing it. They tell you we are creating these global cities. We are creating smart cities. Go online and search for the fastest growing cities or the up-and-coming cities of 2024. These are the places having all of that money pumped into them. 5 or 10 years ago, it was places like Austin and Nashville and Columbus, Ohio. First, they create these blue cities, they infiltrate and rig the elections, and then they expand outward until they have enough population and enough control to flip the whole state. And the problem is, if the state's culture won't go along with becoming a blue state, then all you need to do is buy off the Republicans, and then it's a red state that pursues the exact same agenda. And of course, we have that in Texas and Tennessee and Florida and Arizona. Oh, I know Arizona's very blue now. And if you ask me, it seems like they're going after Montana and Oklahoma and Idaho. So let's turn back to the Associated Press on Saturday. The United States will begin plans to withdraw troops from Niger, U.S. officials said Saturday, in what experts say is a blow to Washington and its allies in the region in terms of staging security operations in the Sahel. The planned departure comes as U.S. officials said they were trying to find a new military agreement. The Prime Minister of Niger, appointed by the ruling military junta, Ali Lamine Zaine, and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell agreed on Friday that the two nations would begin to plan the withdrawal of American troops, the U.S. State Department told the Associated Press in an email Saturday. A U.S. official said there was no timeline for withdrawal besides talks set to start in the coming days about next steps. The official spoke on the condition of anonymity to detail the private diplomatic discussions. An American delegation to coordinate the details of the withdrawal process will be dispatched soon. Niger plays a central role in the U.S. military operations in Africa's Sahel region, an area on the edge of the Sahara Desert. Washington is concerned about the spread of jihadi violence, where local groups have pledged alliance to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State groups. Niger is home to a major U.S. base in the city of Agadez, about 920 kilometers from the capital, Niamey, using it for manned and unmanned surveillance flights and other operations. The U.S. has also invested hundreds of millions of dollars in training Niger's military since it began operations there in 2013. Now, that is a pretty impressive paragraph from the Associated Press, which we are told is an objective news outlet. They just basically made the argument to globalists on why it was necessary to have the United States remain in Niger. They are concerned about, quote unquote, jihadi violence from local groups who have pledged allegiance to terrorist groups created by the global regime. And we're supposed to go along with that, of course, because we know that all of these quote unquote terrorists are attacking our greatest allies in Israel. Let's get a bit more spin from global regime propaganda media. But relations have frayed between Niger and Western countries since mutinous soldiers ousted the country's democratically elected president in July. Niger's junta has since told French forces to leave and turned instead to Russia for security. Earlier this month, Russian military trainers arrived to reinforce the country's air defenses and with Russian equipment to train Nigerians to use. So all of that effort and all of that money the global regime pumped into Niger in the last decade plus has all gone for naught. The U.S., the global regime, believe they still have a right to remain there in Niger. After all, they invested all that money. But unsurprisingly, the people of Niger do not want to be under the control of the global regime. They don't want to be a colony. So they've asked the U.S. to leave and prefer to rely on Russia for security assistance. Sputnik offers an explanation for why these countries are turning to Russia, citing a senior U.S. official. Where the Russians have a real advantage over the United States is they have weapons, and they sell weapons, including helicopters, and they sell small arms. There's a lot of security challenges in Africa, and Africans need weapons. So the claim is that the Americans just aren't able to meet the demand from these African nations. They quote a former intelligence officer at the CIA for Africa named Cameron Hudson, who says, "We are now out. Russia is now in," as well as another U.S. official who says there's a long history of the West telling African countries how to govern, and they're finally saying enough. Now, obviously, 2 out of those 3 quotes don't come attached to a name. We don't know who said that. The quotes are reported by Russian media, but ultimately it's information among other information. The question is, does this framing map onto reality? The answer to that is obviously yes. So we simply keep that in the backs of our minds. We allow reality to just continue happening. We see what new information emerges and then look back and say, oh yeah, those comments, they do sound right. We are hearing about all these arms sales from Russia to Africa, other African nations. We hear stories about them turning to Russia rather than the United States. If those trends continue, then we can assume that this reporting is accurate. Back to the Associated Press. There was an attempt on the behalf of the United States to revise the military agreement with Niger that would allow them to stay, U.S. officials told the AP. But the agreement between Zine and Campbell shows that the effort has failed. A separate senior U.S. State Department official, who also spoke on the condition of anonymity to speak about sensitive diplomatic talks, told the AP on Saturday that Niger's junta made a decision that they don't want any foreign forces in the country, including the U.S., and that the security partnership was ending for the time being. The junta told the U.S. that Russia's presence was to train Nigerians on how to operate the equipment. The official said that the U.S. has valid concerns about some of the choices the junta was making, specifically about the potential for Russian and American troops to be co-located. Well, that is not a decision that the Nigerian junta is making. They're not choosing for the U.S. and Russian troops to be in the same place or in the same country. That's the U.S. choosing that. The U.S. is the country that is not invited by the Nigerians to be there. That's not me saying that. That's not Russian state media saying that. And it's not a conspiracy theory. This is the global regime state media trying to reframe all of this to save face. And it just so happens to match a pattern that we've seen emerge over the last few years in every region on Earth. The loss of access to air bases in Niger is a major setback for the U.S. and its allies in the region because of its strategic location for security operations in the Sahel, said Peter Pham, former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel region. In the short term, they will be hard to replace, said Pham, adding that remaining European Union military presence would likely pull out of Niger following the news of a U.S. departure. Oh, so it's not just the U.S. forces, it's also EU forces who are there under what? The protection of the United States of America's military? So multiple global regime military elements in their country, and we are supposed to think that they must stay there and that we can decide that they should stay there based on claims of terrorism linked to groups that were literally started by this same global regime to serve this exact purpose, to become a destabilizing feature of each one of these countries that then justifies the presence of regime military in order to protect its investments. Back to the article. The rupture of relations between the two nations would impact the development and humanitarian aid funds destined for Niger, a country at the bottom of many indicators of well-being, Pham said. Isn't that shocking? A country that is being occupied and destabilized by the global regime by force, despite the fact that the people of that nation want the global regime out, is dealing with some level of economic devastation. Well, at whose hands? That answer, of course, is the global regime. These are the two tools: military force and economic manipulation, most often in the form of sanctions. And who do those sanctions affect primarily? Well, the people who are just getting by, who are made to suffer further based on the sanctions. The idea being that once the people become discontented enough with the situation economically, that they will be happy when an outside force comes in and puts their government in place. And of course, after being impoverished for some amount of time, it being hard to find work, hard to get ahead, once that new money comes in, once they've overthrown the people's government, then all the people who just want to see their suffering reduced are more than happy to take the regime money and comply. It is a story as old as time. This exact thing has been happening for millennia. The Associated Press quotes the same quote-unquote local activist as they did 6 weeks ago, Insa Garba Saidu, a local activist who assists Niger's military rulers with their communications, told the AP that American troops could potentially return after negotiations and that the ruling Niger junta, the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, wants to maintain a good working relationship with the U.S. And so that sounds like they're more than happy to work with Donald Trump, but the fake president Joe Biden and his illegitimate administration and the rest of the global regime can go kick rocks. The U.S. should find a new mode of engagement that departs from the failed counterterrorism cooperation model of the past decade and continues to press other states in the Sahel region on accountability and human rights abuses, said Hannah Ray Armstrong, a senior consultant on Sahel peace and security. The two officials said that Niger and the U.S. would continue to work together on areas of shared interest. Pentagon Press Secretary and Air Force Major General Pat Ryder gave a press conference yesterday and provided an update on all of this. You can find that on defense.gov. Updating on Niger, he said, "We can confirm the beginning of discussions between the U.S. and Niger for the orderly withdrawal of U.S. forces from the country. The department is providing a small delegation from the Pentagon and U.S. Africa Command to participate in the discussions. In terms of departure timing, we're not going to speculate and get ahead of discussions, so we'll keep you updated on additional details as we have them to provide." So let's move to Nigeria, because there are reports that their president, Bola Tinubu, is calling for the creation of a counterterrorism center for Central Africa. Does it sound like the United States, as a proxy of that global regime, wants to move their quote-unquote counterterrorism efforts to Nigeria after being kicked out of Niger? Now, we talked last year about how the United States had a mission to go and fortify Nigeria's elections. In fact, none other than Stacey Abrams went over there to help. There was a video from, I believe, Antony Blinken, Linda Green Thompson, and Samantha Power. They were all very concerned with fortifying Nigeria's elections because their ally, Bola Tinubu, was on the ballot, and they wanted to make sure that he could be democratically elected. And we covered a lot of this last year, so I don't mean to go all the way back into it, but this is from the BBC.com on March 1st of 2023. Bola Tinubu's Nigeria election win. The rigging claims of Peter Obi and Atiku Abubakar. Both of these candidates from the opposition party joined together to say that the election was rigged. Picking up in the BBC article. They have called for the election to be canceled, alleging breaches of the Electoral Act and possible collusion by the Independent National Electoral Commission to doctor the result in Mr. Tinubu's favor. The allegations have been denied by INEC and Mr. Tinubu's party, the ruling All Progressives Congress. As for opposition parties, they so far have not offered any concrete proof to back up their allegations. At the heart of the dispute is the newly introduced electronic voting system known as BVAS, which was supposed to make the manipulation of results more difficult and the polls more transparent. The widespread inability of electoral staff to upload results from polling units to INEC servers helped fuel allegations of a conspiracy. Fears of rigging emerged on the morning of the election when a popular influencer alleged on social media that INEC's IREV portal, where results are meant to be uploaded, had been breached by hackers. Skipping down. INEC apologized for what it called technical glitches and said that any discrepancies between results on the portal and physical results would be investigated and resolved. Just like they were here. INEC also blamed delays on factors beyond its control, like the lack of internet access at some polling stations. Oh, did they need that internet access for the machines? And there's this near the end. Voting delays were observed across Nigeria. Many people waited from the morning until late at night to vote, but others gave up and went home. In some cases, INEC staff failed to turn up at all at polling stations. This has led to claims that opposition supporters were deliberately disenfranchised. Online, ruling party supporters are pointing to losses suffered by Mr. Tinubu, including in the capital, Abuja, and Lagos, as proof that the election was free and fair. So because Tinubu didn't win everywhere, that means that the elections must have been A-OK, just like here. So Stacey Abrams, Antony Blinken, Samantha Power, UN Ambassador Linda Green Thompson, all of them and more, of course, doing whatever they can to fortify Nigeria's elections the same way they fortified Brazil's elections, the same way they fortified the United States of America's elections, and Bola Tinubu remains in power. So let's catch up to the current day. This is Sputnik Africa again. From yesterday, Nigerian President Tinubu calls for creation of regional anti-terrorism center in Africa. For over a decade, Nigeria has been plagued by insecurity as a result of the Boko Haram insurgency and other extremist factions that have been kidnapping children and adults for ransom, among other criminal activities. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu called for the creation of a regional anti-terrorism center in Africa, the country's presidency said on Monday. President Bola Tinubu has called for establishment of a regional counterterrorism center that will serve as a hub for intelligence sharing, operational coordination, and capacity building throughout Africa, the statement read. He said that structures such as the Regional Intelligence Fusion Unit in Abuja, the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism in Algiers, and the Committee of Intelligence and Security Services of Africa in Addis Ababa must be strengthened in every possible way. Furthermore, Tinubu recalled the importance of implementing the long-proposed idea of creating a rapid reaction force in Africa, which could be used not only in regional conflicts, but also to combat terrorist activities. So they want to create a rapid reaction force to assist in regional conflicts, and he wants to involve some of the other African nations, the ones, of course, who are allies in Tinubu's cause, which we have to assume is the global regime's cause. It almost sounds like they're trying to put together some sort of, African Union. In fact, this is au.int. This is the African Union's website, where they lay out the details of what they call Agenda 2063. And of course, you can look Agenda 2063 up on Wikipedia. Agenda 2063 is a set of initiatives proposed and currently under implementation by the African Union. Here are their 15 flagship projects. A high-speed train network connecting all African capitals and commercial centers. The formulation of a strategy for transforming the African economy from a supplier of raw materials to one that actively uses its own resources. The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The introduction of the African Union passport and removal of all visa requirements for its holders within Africa. Ending all wars, civil conflicts, gender-based violence, and violent conflicts by 2020. And I guess they must have missed that mark, because right now they're telling us that they need a counterterrorism center that would house a quick reaction force for regional conflicts. And if you are going to handle regional conflicts on behalf of the African Union, then anything you need to handle qualifies as terrorism. But let's go on. The construction of a third Inga Dam. And dams are great because that allows the regime to control the water supply and create water shortages whenever necessary. It's hard to profit off what would otherwise be free unless you're able to control supply and distribution. And of course, after you do this for a while, you can then begin to create shortages and extract money from people unwittingly, implementing all sorts of agendas based on the energy and resource shortages you have created by controlling supply and distribution of something that would otherwise exist freely to everyone. And naturally, we see this happening in the United States all the time. Trump talks about it often, most particularly citing California, that consistently complains of droughts despite the fact that the government is the cause of the water shortages. But let's go through the rest of these Agenda 2063 flagship projects. The establishment of the single African air transport market. The establishment of an annual African Economic Forum. The establishment of a set of financial institutions envisaged as an African investment bank, a Pan-African stock exchange, an African monetary fund, and an African central bank. A Pan-African digital network. The development of a common African strategy for the use of outer space technology. The establishment of an African open digital distance learning university. Cooperation on cybersecurity. The foundation of a great African museum, preserving African cultural heritage and promoting Pan-Africanism. The compilation of an Encyclopedia Africana as an authoritative resource on the authentic history of Africa and African life. So a total global regime takeover. They are going to bring all the countries of Africa into one African Union, and together they will all be forced to implement the African aspects of the global regime's agenda, centralizing all of Africa the same way they have centralized Europe with the European Union and centralized, America 250 years ago. And it's okay to admit that while also understanding that there were good founders who worked for the right things, and we can focus on those values regardless of the purpose of their implementation or what they were ultimately used to create by the global regime. But back to the article. Tinubu also stressed that to effectively combat terrorism, Africa must address its roots, quote, which include poverty, inequality, and social injustice, end quote, while also combating unlawful activities that, quote, feed terrorism, ransom, and illegal mining. And illegal mining, what could that even mean? What a strange term and a strange concept. Are there rogue individuals sneaking into mines and hammering away at them with their pickaxe in the dead of night? Really got to wonder what's going on there. Moreover, he said, the entire world should take part in this fight. We shall be knocking on this door of the international community to answer this call for justice, peace, and fair play, Tinubu said, sounding every bit like the globalist he is. Speaking about Nigeria's efforts to combat terrorism, Tinubu stated that the country's counterterrorism capabilities have been strengthened by the introduction of the Terrorist Prevention and Prohibition Act, which established the National Counterterrorism Center. And if there's any cause in this world to rejoice, it's that the global regime is able to set up more counterterrorism centers while they call normal, peaceful Americans terrorists. The head of state also urged action to stop the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in Africa and reaffirmed his country's commitment to engage with regional partners to tighten arms control measures, improve border security, and disrupt illegal trafficking networks that, quote unquote, fuel terrorism. And it's amazing, isn't it? Right after we heard about Russia supplying weapons to Niger, as Niger removes the regime from their country, they want to move next door to Nigeria, set up their counterterrorism operation there, and make sure that small arms can't get into Africa. It almost just kind of sounds like the regime is trying to make sure that Russia can't actually support these countries as they attempt to keep the global regime out of their nations. Lastly, the president assured that Nigeria is doing everything possible to deal with the problem, this being terrorism, including addressing the, quote, economic and social enablers, enhancing intelligence gathering, and strengthening the judiciary to effectively deal with cases of terrorism. So as always, we see the same dynamics and the same battle playing out. The global regime versus sovereign nationalists around the world. The centralized and centralizing global evil twin and the decentralized and decentralizing good twin worldwide. It is not some kind of mistake that these sovereign nationalist countries or countries that are moving in that direction overlap almost exactly with the BRICS nations, whereas the members of the global regime overlap exactly with the British Commonwealth nations, European colonies that we're told are not colonies at all, but their own countries, and the U.S. protected regime proxy states in Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The same stories playing out again and again and again. Now, Donald Trump was able to be seen as something of a driving force behind all of this when he was serving his first term as the duly elected president. Now, in this second term, where we have Joe Biden pretending to be president, Donald Trump cannot be the guy seen to be leading this. This cannot be an alliance of nations implementing any plan involving Donald Trump. And the truth is, Donald Trump is just taking care of the American aspects of this plan. In the multipolar world order that is emerging, the idea is that there will be regions of responsibility where some of the superpowers step in to defend the smaller nations and they engage in trade, etc., but that countries would be sovereign in taking care of themselves primarily. There wouldn't be a centralized and centralizing one world government overseeing everything, figuring out where it needs to send the U.S. military or its little military organizations like NATO. Control and influence would be split apart and decentralized. And because it's been drilled into our head now for decades that all of these countries that make up this multipolar world order as it emerges, these BRICS nations, many of them we've been told are our adversaries. And why would we be told that? Because they're the nations who could threaten the seemingly unbreakable dominance of this global regime. China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and Saudi Arabia, these are powerful nations. And if the global regime can't control them, then it's harder to control their smaller, weaker neighbors. And if the global regime and its proxy behind the uniparty government in the United States can't control the world through the use of military force or economic manipulation, then they can't control the world at all. And we're seeing they don't really have any other method. It's been many years since the kinetic and hot part of this kind of U.S. and Russian proxy war in Syria. And of course, we've been told that Bashar Al Assad is one of the worst men on the planet because he has absolutely no problem calling that regime out as evil. Well, he just did an interview with Russian television and gave this long quote. It's very intriguing. Power has made the West decadent, and decadence has appeared in the political class. Western politicians are focused on their personal careers, and they no longer care about the interests of their countries. The media create a virtual reality that works to destroy the family, atomizing and isolating a person from his surroundings. All this may expose them to the loss of their achievements in the future. I said that the Russian special military operation would correct the course of history. For me, there is no difference in where Russia is fighting world terror, in Syria or in Ukraine. There is only one enemy. I am sure that the confrontation will end with the victory of Russia, and it will reunite brotherly nations again. That is why I said that Russia corrects what others have corrupted. Western policy, especially American, is based on the principle of divide and rule. America turns any conflict into a dangerous chronic disease. With any conflict, America benefits and then steps aside and watches the growing chaos, waiting for the right moment to strike the decisive blow. For America, every conflict is profitable. After the dissolution of the USSR, there was an illusion that liberalism had won the final victory, that heaven on earth should resemble America both politically and economically. It seemed that money was intended to become the main goal of life, for which we should sacrifice ethics, morality, and humanism. However, China has proposed a different model, a balanced combination of communist ideals with a capitalist economy. In its case, a centralized social state coexists with the economic freedom of private enterprises. Since 2008, we have seen that China is steadily growing against the backdrop of a stable decline in the West. That is, China has proven that elements of capitalism are necessary for the economy, but capitalism as a format of state governance is doomed. Now, obviously, I don't agree with any of that last part, except to the extent that the idea of capitalism itself has been distorted. We should be focused on discussing free and open markets as the foundation of capitalism. Of course, capitalism as a concept, they've been attempting to invert that as well. We are told we have capitalism here in America. That could not be further from the truth. The government and our corporations are working hand in hand. They are pursuing the same agenda toward power together, and it's not even just for the power of this government and those corporations. They are both working in service of a much bigger and broader global regime agenda. And again, it's not like any of this is hidden. So the corporate and the state are joining together to pursue common interests at the expense of the people who want nothing to do with it. That is definitionally fascism, and it is a collectivist ideology. The collectivist ideology is the problem. The idea that we have free and open market capitalism in America is preposterous. But to the extent that America has been branded as the center of capitalism for so long, it is part of the American identity that we are a capitalist society, then whatever sort of society we have then gets called capitalist. The agenda of the World Economic Forum is referred to as stakeholder capitalism. Again, that's just fascism. China's form is called state capitalism. Again, same thing. It should then be no surprise that the system in the United States is exactly aligned with its major world power partners, especially understanding that all of those partners are pursuing this same agenda. If you then take that agenda, which is global communism, which is fascism, which is neo-feudalism, and then you define that as capitalism, well, of course, capitalism's not going to be an ideal situation under those terms. That's why it's important to focus on the fact that we need open and free markets, decentralized as possible. Again, another aspect of Bitcoin in the future that we hope emerges with a currency that exists outside the control mechanisms of that global regime. We can also understand that Assad, in the way he is describing the West, whether or not we agree with it, is accurately expressing the sentiment of leaders around the world who have had to deal with the influence of that global regime, the economic manipulation, the interference in their sovereign political situations, and of course, the constant threat of American military power behind it if they don't comply and behave. Obviously, no American that cares about open and free markets wants to pursue a Chinese-style system. But other countries are free to do what they like, and they're free to call it whatever they want. We discussed Venezuela last week and what might happen with the oil sanctions. We discussed their desire to take Guyana back from the global regime and discussed their planned elections coming up in July. This is from yesterday, April 22nd, in Reuters. Venezuela to accelerate cryptocurrency shift as oil sanctions return. How about that? Venezuela's state-run oil company PDVSA plans to increase its digital currency usage in its crude and fuel exports as the U.S. reimposes oil sanctions on the country, three people familiar with the plan said. The U.S. Treasury Department last week gave PDVSA's customers and providers until May 31st to wind down transactions under a general license it did not renew due to a lack of electoral reforms. The move will make it more difficult for the country to increase oil output and exports, as companies will have to wait for individual U.S. authorizations to do business with Venezuela. PDVSA since last year had been slowly moving oil sales to USDT, a digital currency also known as Tether, whose value is pegged to the US dollar and designed to maintain a stable value. The return of oil sanctions is speeding up the shift, a move to reduce the risk of sale proceeds getting frozen in foreign bank accounts due to the measures, the people said. So they are intending to avoid those financial manipulations. The article also notes that the U.S. dollar is the preferred currency for transactions in the global oil market, and that even though they are emerging in some countries, payments in cryptocurrency are not frequent. But the point is that more and more countries move away from trading with the dollar worldwide. In fact, this is yesterday at Watcher.guru. BRICS, Russia and China completely ditch U.S. dollar for trade. Russia and China completely ditch U.S. dollar for trade. How well could our sanctions be working? In what is certainly an important moment for the BRICS alliance, Russia and China have completely ditched the U.S. dollar for trade. Indeed, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has recently stated that the economic bilateral relations between the two countries have undergone near complete de-dollarization. The abandonment of the greenback in these trade dealings has been a continued goal for the economic alliance. Now, more than 90% of the nation's bilateral trade dealings are settled in either the yuan or ruble. Subsequently, the two countries are now set to continue those efforts that have yielded monumental results. Throughout the last several years, the BRICS Economic Alliance has held firm to the hope for de-dollarization in the global south. It has opted to embrace national currency promotion in the hope of lessening Western dominance over global economics. Just 4 months into 2024, and that goal has taken substantial strides. Now, amid the BRICS alliance flourishment, Russia and China have announced they have almost completely ditched the dollar in bilateral trade. This undoubtedly stems from Russian sanctions employed following the latter's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, the weaponization of the U.S. dollar was the premier catalyst to birth these de-dollarization efforts. It has evolved into a key pillar of the BRICS infrastructure. This development will certainly also be beneficial to both the ruble and the yuan. Moreover, it should set a precedent for increased prominence of national currency usage as a byproduct of de-dollarization. It will be interesting to see how this could influence further action from other BRICS participating partners. Now, in response to this news, people were sending around an article from thestreet.com from last year that highlights an Elon Musk post on X, formerly Twitter, where he said if you weaponize currency enough times, other countries will stop using it. The article also quotes wannabe elite and very serious intellectual globalist Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group and G0. He said 1 year ago, despite its growing role in the global economy and long-standing desire to unseat the dollar, China lacks the investor protections, institutional quality, and capital market openness required to internationalize a yuan that is still not fully convertible overseas. He said the most serious threat to the dollar was coming from within. He said the United States is still the most powerful nation on earth, but it is also the most politically divided and dysfunctional of all the major industrial democracies. The single biggest risk to the dollar's global status is that growing inequality, tribalism, polarization, and gridlock eventually undermine trust in America's stability and credibility. So you see, the dollar is crashing because of us. It's because we believed all the disinformation. And don't worry, China's never going to take over. This is a year ago. Ian Bremmer, very serious intellectual, wannabe elite, globalist stooge. Just an absolute genius. He guests on everybody's show. Well, it turns out he was exactly wrong. And it is not U.S. political instability that is causing the de-dollarization around the world. It is simply the emergence of a multipolar world order. Countries no longer want to be subject to the global regime's military influence, using the United States of America's military as its proxy, nor do they want to be subject to the manipulations coming all the way from the top, the global bankers, again using the United States as their proxy and their enforcement mechanism for when the economic manipulations don't work. Here is Politico from last week. This is from April 15th. Trump trade advisors plot dollar devaluation. Economic advisors close to former President Donald Trump are actively debating ways to devalue the U.S. dollar if he's elected to a second term. He already was. A dramatic move that could boost U.S. exports, but also reignite inflation and threaten the dollar's position as the world's dominant currency. And I imagine all of that will be taken care of under the illegitimate president's supposed administration. The idea is being discussed by former trade chief Robert Lighthizer, a potential Treasury Secretary pick for Trump and the architect of the former president's bruising tariff campaign against China, and policy advisors allied with him, according to 3 former Trump administration officials granted anonymity to discuss confidential policy plans. And not to get into a tangent or anything, but if it's not clear by now, the decoupling from China was a wonderful and necessary Trump administration priority. Purposely devaluing the U.S. dollar by pressing other countries to alter their own currency values would represent the most aggressive proposal yet in Trump's attempts to reshape global trade. And this is how they will describe it. But global trade is being adjusted through negotiations with these other nations. The potential moves would go beyond the tariffs of Trump's first term and the expansive industrial subsidies for clean energy enacted by President Joe Biden. A weaker dollar would make U.S. exports cheaper on the world market and potentially reduce the U.S.'s yawning trade deficit. But weakening the dollar could have other far-reaching consequences, from sending consumer prices for imported products soaring to inviting retaliation from other countries and threatening the dollar's role as world reserve currency, which would undermine U.S. sanctions on adversaries like Iran and Russia. And as we've been discussing at length with a multitude of examples, these other countries don't care about U.S. sanctions. There is already no bite to these sanctions. They are not working. The de-dollarization is already happening. Politico is attempting to reframe this in a way that will benefit them later. The potential policy shift during a second Trump term could further fragment the global economy, a post-pandemic trend top finance officials are already grappling with as they gather in Washington this week for the yearly spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And these meetings made headlines last week as the IMF decried spending habits of the United States government. We are becoming a risky financial investment, even while having the global reserve currency. It's amazing, isn't it? I'm not going to go through this entire article. Feel free to check it out on your own. I'm going to hit a few more spots, though. Lighthizer, one of the few cabinet members to survive Trump's full first term, retains significant influence on the former president's trade and economic policies from his post as the trade chief at the America First Policy Institute, a think tank set up to devise policies for a second Trump administration, or third, it's okay. Trump's first administration dabbled in currency policy back in 2019 by taking the rare step of designating China as a currency manipulator, meaning it was unfairly devaluing its currency, the yuan, to make its exports cheaper and gain an advantage in global trade. But that designation took place after Trump had already imposed tariffs on the Chinese economy, and his White House never went further to address the currency imbalance with policies like the ones that Lighthizer is considering today. Biden did not renew China's designation as a currency manipulator when he took office. Well, that's probably because Biden's not president. Regarding Lighthizer, Politico writes, the former trade advisor endorses the idea of dollar devaluation in his 2023 book, No Trade is Free, writing that it is clear that the dollar is, quote unquote, well overvalued, and that the U.S. could make a number of moves to correct that imbalance. Further down, national security hawks also worry that weakening the dollar could take the bite out of U.S. sanctions on foreign countries like Russia and Iran. Again, already done. That is already baked into the cake. They don't care about U.S. sanctions. Those sanctions rely on the dollar's use as the dominant currency in world trade and finance. If the dollar was devalued enough to make other nations switch to using another currency in international transactions, the U.S. Treasury would no longer have the ability to freeze those assets as it has done with officials in adversarial nations. Now, if you've listened to this show for any length of time, you'll know that we've been tracking this for quite a while. This isn't something that is going to happen in the future, as Politico is attempting to frame it. This is something that has already happened. Standard issue villagers have no idea about this, and they will listen to the television when the television tells them that all of this is just happening now, and it's all Donald Trump's fault. He's reducing America's standing in the world. All of it'll be nonsense. This is already baked into the cake. Sanction effectiveness depends on the U.S. having a world reserve currency, said the first former Trump administration official. And this, of course, is someone Politico talked to. They just can't tell you who it is. And so I think there's a clear tension there between two objectives. One of reducing the trade deficit and two of ensuring that there's sanctions effectiveness. So a former Trump administration official who has seemingly no idea what the Trump administration is trying to do. Politico closes out the article this way. I'm going to go through the last few paragraphs here. World governments should expect the tariff threat to be more explicit if Lighthizer is empowered in a future Trump administration, said the former officials with knowledge of the plans, noting that Lighthizer endorses the idea in his book, saying that it's, quote unquote, hard to believe. Other nations would have agreed to the Plaza Accord if they, quote, had not been concerned about the possibility that Congress would raise tariffs, end quote. The administration could even impose tariffs preemptively and then offer currency negotiations as a way to get the duties reduced, the former officials added. Oh, you mean he's going to negotiate using leverage? How dare he? Short of a multilateral agreement, the Trump administration could use the threat of tariffs to force individual countries, especially China, to the table for bilateral currency negotiations, said the former officials. One legal tool that's been floated is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which authorizes tariffs of up to 15% against countries that have, quote unquote, large and serious trade surpluses with the U.S. The Trump administration could also impose across-the-board tariffs on imports, making them more expensive for U.S. consumers, the former officials said. Trump is considering a 10% universal import tariff, the former officials said, and one result of that policy could be to make the dollar weaker relative to other currencies. But even economists that support a currency revaluation stress that those approaches have drawbacks, even from the perspective of reducing the trade deficit, one of Lighthizer clear goals, or at least according to these people. Unless there is a multilateral grand bargain like the Plaza Accords, which even Lighthizer's allies acknowledge will be difficult, trading partners could negate efforts to weaken the dollar by cutting their own interest rates, imposing their own tariffs, or subsidizing their domestic producers, all of which could undermine the effect of U.S. policy shifts. Again, we're just not going to be able to control the world anymore. Crap, we were doing such a great job with it. And now, as if this whole de-dollarization thing is some sort of trend that needs to be addressed, Donald Trump posted this morning on Truth Social. The dollar has just hit a 34-year high against the yen, a total disaster for the United States. When I was president, I spent a good deal of time telling Japan and China in particular, you can't do that. It sounds good to stupid people, but it is a disaster for our manufacturers and others. They are actually unable to compete and will be forced to either lose lots of business or build plants or whatever in the quote unquote smart countries. This is what made Japan and China into behemoths years ago. I put limits on both and others, and if they violated those limits, there was hell to pay. Biden has let it go. Watch them now pick apart the U.S. It will be an open field day. Don't let this happen, Crooked Joe. Wake up and smell the roses. Trump is obviously giving a preview on where all this is headed, and he is letting everyone know exactly whose policies have done this to America. And of course, it's the policies of that same global regime. And finally, let's go to some interesting comments made by RFK Jr. at an event in support of his fake presidential campaign.
I'm going to put the entire U.S. budget on blockchain so that every American can look at every budget item in the entire budget anytime they want, 24 hours a day. And if somebody is spending $16,000 for a toilet seat, everybody's going to know about it.
Now, I know that was a little hard to hear between RFK's voice and the crowd noise and the fact that this was recorded at a live event. He essentially said, I'm going to put the entire U.S. budget on blockchain. So every American can look at every budget item in the entire budget anytime they want, 24 hours a day. We're going to have 300 million eyeballs on our budget, saying that if there's someone buying a $16,000 toilet seat, everybody's going to know about it. This was reported on the website Cointelegraph.com, writing, Kennedy's plan would allow for more transparency and accountability, allowing taxpayers to see where their tax dollars are spent. The blockchain proposal was lauded by many crypto advocates on social media, where people claimed it would be revolutionary and end corruption. One user wrote that transparent public accounting might be the best use case for blockchain tech besides the supply chain. Quote, checks and balances in our government doesn't work if the branches are in on the corruption together. President and Congress particularly. It's time the people hold them accountable. Very well said. Some, however, have criticized the plan, claiming Kennedy is advocating for a central bank digital currency via his blockchain plan. However, in the past, Kennedy has vowed to end U.S. efforts to move toward a CBDC, claiming it infringes on privacy. Donald Trump is also committed to never implementing a central bank digital currency. Kennedy has also come out in favor of Bitcoin, which is the opposite of a central bank digital currency. And Trump has, at least narratively speaking, warmed up to the idea of Bitcoin as well. It is almost a certainty that Donald Trump has been pro-Bitcoin for the entire time. Now, there is absolutely no chance that RFK Jr. is going to win an election over Donald Trump. RFK Jr. doesn't even talk about the fact that our elections are rigged and stolen. And of course, throughout his campaign, he is constantly catering to the needs of his allies on the uniparty left and various other members of the Trump deranged community. But this idea is fantastic. Make the entire budget totally transparent and viewable in real time, trackable in real time. We have become so far detached from any understanding of what our government is doing with all of this money that they continue to print and spend, always on the backs of the American people, the full faith and credit of the United States of America. They just continue to extend our indentured servitude for generations on down the line, and that allows them a justification for continued constant printing of money from the central banks through the regime's fiat currency currently branded as the American dollar. We can see the future emerging, and it is going to include this technology, and it's going to include Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a critical part of all of this technological picture that is emerging. We talked quite a bit about this on a finance panel at GART and through some other discussions, a lot of interactions with retired Space Force General Stephen Quast. I am convinced that this is where we are headed. Now, that doesn't mean that just one day we are going to wake up in some blossoming utopia. It is going to be a new world, and one that will require and necessitate considerable adjustment. But this is where the path is leading, and we need to be prepared to understand it so we can be prepared to confront it. Now, I may take the day off tomorrow. I am trying to update merch and the merch site. I'm trying to write. I got a lot of other stuff going on that I want to focus on. I also do genuinely want to start a live show. I think it's going to be particularly for paid subscribers, and I will figure out a way to either host that on Rumble or Locals or one of those platforms. If it's Locals and requires a subscription, I'm going to try to just import all of the paid subscriber base from Substack and make that work for the local subscription as well. But I'm still figuring out how to navigate all of that. If I can do private streams on Rumble for paid subscribers, I will very likely just do that. But keep an eye on your Substack notifications, because I will make that announcement as a blog post on Substack. So if you are a paid subscriber, you will get that immediately. And obviously, if there's a bunch of major stuff happening and I want to talk about it, then I will have an episode out tomorrow, but most likely Thursday. So I will be back tomorrow or Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's